On the 20th of January 1936, in a house on the Sandringham estate, a child was born. On that very same day, England was mourning. King George V had died. It is said that Queen Mary learned of the baby's arrival only moments before the king took his final breath. Two events, life and departure, tied together by a single date, and standing quietly between them was Park House. This house was more than a residence. It stood on royal land, close to the place where power, duty, and history had intersected for generations. Park House had watched faces come and go, heard conversations that never appeared in official records, and preserved the atmosphere of a world where privilege always carried a price. With the birth of this child, it became the starting point of a story that would echo across two generations of Spencer women. The child was named Francis Ruth Burke Roche. Her father was Edmund Roche, the 4th Baron Fermoy, a close friend of the royal family. Her mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, moved comfortably within the highest social circles and served as confidante and lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. Francis, therefore, grew up quite literally in the shadow of the crown, surrounded by traditions that did not need explanation because they were simply understood. She was first educated at home, later at a convent school. Francis proved disciplined, ambitious, and gifted in sport. As a teenager, she became head girl and captain of games. For a time, even a national tennis tournament and the possibility of playing at Wimbledon seemed within reach, until a sudden bout of appendicitis ended that dream. It was a small but early lesson that even privileged lives can change direction in a single moment. Yet her path still seemed clearly mapped. In the 1950s, for a young aristocratic woman, lineage usually meant one thing: a suitable marriage. Park House had accustomed Francis to life close to the monarchy. Soon it would become the quiet origin of a different kind of closeness, one that did not protect, but bind. Because this calm house, however peaceful it appeared, stood at the beginning of a chain of expectations and decisions that would one day shape the life of another Spencer daughter. By the early 1950s, Francis's path seemed firmly set. The world in which she had grown up did not encourage hesitation. It encouraged obedience. And then a man entered her life who appeared to embody everything that Park House had quietly prepared her for. John Spencer, known as Johnny, Viscount Althorp. He was 12 years older than Francis, heir to one of England's oldest aristocratic titles, and deeply intertwined with the British monarchy. Johnny served as equerry to King George VI and later to the young Queen Elizabeth II. The Spencer family had long stood close to the center of royal life. For high society, this match seemed not only appropriate but inevitable. A daughter raised at Park House, and the future Earl Spencer. Lineage, royal proximity, social prestige, every element fit neatly into place. Their relationship progressed quickly. Francis was only 16 when she first met Johnny. 2 years later, their engagement was announced. And on the 1st of June, 1954, they were married at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony carried the grandeur one would expect from such a union. Members of the royal family filled the pews. Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, the Queen Mother, and Princess Margaret were among the distinguished guests. Newspapers described it as the society wedding of the year. Francis was just 18 years old, the youngest bride of the 20th century to stand at the Abbey's altar. Photographs captured a radiant young woman in ivory silk beside a man already firmly established in his role. Beneath the towering arches of Westminster Abbey, the moment seemed like the beginning of an aristocratic fairy tale. After the wedding, Francis stepped fully into the world that Park House had quietly prepared her for. Althorp House, the Spencer family's ancestral seat in Northamptonshire, became her new home. For more than 5 centuries, the estate had belonged to the Spencer family, its halls lined with portraits of ancestors and reminders of legacy. Here, Francis became Viscountess Althorp. From her, society expected dignity, discretion, and above all, continuity. The marriage appeared flawless from the outside, yet its perfection rested on a fragile balance. Park House have introduced Francis to the proximity of the crown as a privilege, At Althorp, she would learn that such privilege always came with expectations, and that the most important of those expectations had yet to arrive. Once the excitement of the wedding had faded, the real test of Francis's marriage quietly began. Within the Spencer family, a union was not considered complete until it produced a male heir. Titles, land, and centuries of lineage had to be secured, and that responsibility rested almost entirely on the young woman who had moved from Park House into the world of Althorp. Francis did her best to meet the expectations placed upon her. She managed the household, attended social engagements, and followed the unwritten rules that governed aristocratic life. Yet above everything hung a single expectation that shaped each passing year. A son had to be born. Not eventually, but soon. In 1955, just 1 year after the wedding, Francis gave birth to her first child. It was a daughter, Sarah. 2 years later, another daughter followed, Jane. Publicly, both births were celebrated as joyful occasions. Privately, however, disappointment lingered. Johnny Spencer had hoped for a boy, and with each daughter the pressure grew heavier. Over the following years, Francis experienced pregnancy after pregnancy, 6 in less than a decade, not all of which ended successfully. Later accounts suggested that her husband left little room for her own independence. Everything revolved around a single objective. The Spencer line required a male successor, and Francis was expected to provide one. In 1959, she became pregnant again. Hope within the family rose once more. On the 12th of January 1960, she finally delivered a son, John Spencer, Viscount Althorp II. For a brief moment it seemed that the expectations had finally been fulfilled. But the moment lasted only hours. The baby lived for just 10 hours before dying, most likely from a severe birth defect affecting the lungs. What followed became one of the most painful memories of Francis's life. Her husband forbade her from seeing the infant. Still weak after childbirth, she pleaded to hold her son at least once. The nursery doors were locked. The baby's body was taken away. Francis never saw her child, neither in life nor in death. The loss itself was devastating, but being denied the chance to say goodbye made the wound even deeper. A silent fracture formed between Francis and Johnny. Trust, compassion, and closeness faded away. Park House had once introduced her to the privileges of aristocratic life. Now she was learning the harsher truth, that within this world, duty could sometimes outweigh even the most basic human tenderness. At just 23 years old, Francis had already endured more than many people face in an entire lifetime. And still, the expectations did not disappear. Just a little more than a year after the death of her infant son, Francis became pregnant again. Once more, hopes and expectations gathered around her as if the past could somehow be corrected. Park House, the place where her own life had begun in the shadow of the monarchy, still lingered in the background of this story. It had shaped the world that had raised her, a world where appearances and tradition carried enormous weight. On the 1st of July 1961, Francis gave birth to a healthy baby girl. Her name was Diana. Yet the reaction within the family was restrained. There was no open celebration, no overwhelming relief. Once again, it was not a son. Later accounts would note that the family had not even prepared a girl's name in advance. For an entire week, the baby remained unnamed, as if the family needed time to accept that another daughter had arrived instead of the long-awaited male heir. The disappointment did not remain unspoken. Instead, questions quietly began to circulate about Francis herself. Why, some wondered, was she unable to produce a son? These doubts did not come only from distant relatives. Even her own mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, encouraged her to undergo medical examinations. In London's prestigious Harley Street clinics, Francis submitted to a series of intrusive tests designed to discover a problem that, in reality, did not exist. The irony, of course, was that science had long established that the father determines a child's sex. Yet, in the social world Francis inhabited, logic mattered less than perception. Within aristocratic circles, the burden of failure was placed squarely on the woman. Meanwhile, Johnny Spencer grew increasingly distant. His temper sharpened, his drinking became more noticeable, and warmth disappeared from the marriage. Francis felt isolated and reduced to a single function within the family structure. The birth of Diana did not heal the relationship between husband and wife. Instead, it deepened the emotional distance between them. In 1964, Francis finally gave birth to the long-awaited son, Charles Spencer, who would later become the 9th Earl Spencer. Outwardly, the family's goal had been achieved. The line was secure. Yet the marriage had already been hollowed out by years of pressure and grief. Park House had once been the starting point of Francis's life near the crown. Now another Spencer daughter was growing up within that same orbit. 2 generations connected by the same expectations, the same traditions, and perhaps the same quiet tensions that had already begun to reshape the family's future. By the mid-1960s, the marriage between Francis and Johnny Spencer existed largely in appearance. To the outside world, they remained a proper aristocratic couple. Inside the walls of Althorp, however, distance had replaced affection. Johnny's drinking had become more noticeable, and his manner increasingly controlling. Affairs on his side were quietly tolerated, as such behavior was often overlooked in aristocratic circles of that era. For Frances, however, there was no such freedom. Her life was defined by expectation and restraint. It was during this period that she met Peter Shand Kydd, a wealthy businessman and heir to a wallpaper manufacturing fortune. Peter was confident, sociable, and attentive in a way that felt entirely different from the world Frances knew. What began as a friendship soon deepened into something more personal. For Frances, Peter represented warmth and independence, 2 things that had gradually disappeared from her marriage. Their relationship became an affair. And eventually, Frances made a decision that, within the rigid structure of British high society, was considered almost unthinkable. In 1967, she left Johnny Spencer. She was 31 years old and stepping directly against the rules that had governed her life since childhood. The British press responded with ferocity. Newspapers portrayed the story as scandal, and Frances quickly received a label that would follow her for decades. The bolter. A woman who abandons her marriage. Yet the harshest blow came not from the tabloids but from within her own family. When Johnny Spencer filed for divorce and accused Frances of adultery, her mother, Ruth, Lady Fermoy, openly supported her son-in-law. In court, she testified against her own daughter, declaring Frances an unfit mother. Within the aristocratic code of honor, reputation and tradition outweighed maternal loyalty. The divorce proceedings reached their conclusion in 1969. The judgment was devastating for Frances. She not only lost her marriage but also custody of her children. The court awarded sole guardianship to Johnny Spencer. Diana was 7 years old, Charles 5, while their sisters Sarah and Jane were slightly older. Frances was granted only limited access to them, and even those visits were sometimes difficult to arrange. For Diana, one memory remained especially vivid. She later described watching her mother stand on the driveway at Althorp, seeing the car slowly disappear into the distance. She did not understand why her mother was leaving, only that she was gone. In that moment, the separation between mother and daughter became more than physical. It became a silence that would shape both of their lives for years to come. After the divorce, there was little left in England that felt like home for Frances. The society that had once welcomed her now kept its distance. London carried too many memories, too many headlines, too many judgments. Together with Peter Shand Kydd, she sought a place far removed from that world. In 1972, they moved to the small Scottish island of Seil, off the west coast near Oban. Seil was the complete opposite of Park House. There were no royal neighbors, no aristocratic gatherings, no expectations tied to lineage, only wind sweeping across the hills, the sound of waves against the rocky shore, and a community where status meant far less than character. Frances settled into a modest farmhouse and slowly embraced a simpler life. She wore practical clothes instead of society fashion, spent time fishing along the coast, walked her dog along narrow country roads, and even opened a small shop selling local crafts and souvenirs. To the people of Seil, She was not a scandalous aristocrat, or the woman once called the bolter. She was simply Mrs. Shand Kydd, a quiet neighbor who blended into the rhythm of island life. For the first time since her youth at Park House, Frances seemed to experience a sense of normality life, measured not by titles but by ordinary days. Yet even on this remote island, the past never disappeared completely. In England, her children were growing up without her. In 1975, Johnny Spencer inherited the title of Earl Spencer, and the family moved permanently to Althorp. Diana and her siblings now lived surrounded by centuries of family portraits and tradition, a world that had once defined Frances herself. Contact between Frances and her children remained limited. Letters were exchanged, and there were occasional visits, but the distance was difficult to bridge. Diana, in particular, felt the absence deeply. Later in life, she spoke about a lingering fear of abandonment that followed her into adulthood. Over time, small steps toward reconciliation began to appear. Frances gradually reconnected with her daughters, and later with Diana as well. When Diana became engaged to Prince Charles in 1980, Frances was invited to Balmoral, a quiet acknowledgement that despite everything, she remained Diana's mother. But with Diana's wedding in 1981, everything changed again. As Diana stepped into the world as Princess of Wales, the spotlight that Frances had once tried to escape suddenly returned. In the final chapter of her life, Frances no longer searched for a place in society. Instead, she searched for something far quieter. Peace. After nearly 2 decades in Scotland, even the life she had built there began to unravel. In 1988, her second marriage came to an end when Peter Shand Kydd left her for another woman. The irony was painful. The woman who had once risked everything for love now found herself alone again. This time, however, Frances did not run from the silence that followed. Instead, she turned towards something deeper. In 1994, she made a decision that surprised many who knew her. She converted to Roman Catholicism. For a woman raised within the traditions of the Church of England and the social world of Park House and Althorp, it was a significant step. For Frances, the Catholic faith offered something she had rarely found elsewhere in life: a language of forgiveness. After years defined by judgment, scandal, and loss, she seemed to seek a form of spiritual reconciliation. In quiet churches and prayer houses, far from the noise of headlines, she tried to make sense of the storms that had shaped her life. Yet, even this search for peace could not fully mend the relationship with Diana. By the mid-1990s, tensions had returned. Frances expressed discomfort with the way Diana's personal struggles were becoming public through interviews and media appearances. Diana, in turn, felt hurt by her mother's criticism. In the summer of 1997, their communication stopped. Letters went unanswered. Once again, silence stood between them. Then, on the 31st of August 1997, Diana died in a car crash in Paris. The news reached Frances in the middle of the night on the island of Seil. The possibility of reconciliation vanished instantly. No final conversation, no moment to repair what had been left unresolved. It was a grief that would follow her for the rest of her life. Francis Shand Kydd died on the 3rd of June, 2004, at the age of 68. At her quiet funeral in Scotland, 2 young men attended who symbolized the enduring link between past and future: Prince William and Prince Harry. Through them, the bond between mother and daughter, however complicated, had never truly disappeared.